The sixth and final big takeaway from this little exercise that we created was how it revealed, how it exposed a series of methods on the view, as well as this HTML helper class that emitted HTML tags. So, for example, here we are in this layout.cs HTML page. The very first thing that we saw was this @renderBody, and this renderBody method is just built in. It's part of the base page that every view inherits from. And what it did was it allowed us to insert our view, the home/index.cs HTML, all the presentation logic inside of that, into this Chrome, this template, and it just spit it out right there. Now, we can also use some other render methods. There's also a render page. We'll learn about that later. Render section will allow us to create our own custom sections so that we can have multiple areas where we can poke stuff into from our view pages. We'll learn about that later. But more interesting to me is this HTML.action link, because this HTML method or HTML object's a little bit misunderstood sometimes. Notice that this action link has just a ton of input parameters here, and some of them have some pretty strange syntax. We'll cover it in more depth later on, but you probably have never seen anything quite like that before if this is in fact your first time looking at ASP.NET MVC. Let's run the application and kind of get a sense of what is emitted from that HTML action link. Notice that it has this literal string application name, and it just so happens that I can find a matching literal string here on the home page, and if I hover my mouse cursor over it, I can also see that as it highlights down there in the bottom bar, we can see that it's always a link back to the home page. Alright, one other thing we can do is actually view the source, and I hate when Internet Explorer just blows that way out like that, but here we go. All of that HTML.action link method with all those input parameters, all it did was just produce that little highlighted line of code, line number 20. So we're simply creating an anchor. It will always go to the href/, which means the root of the website, and it has a class defined, the navbar-brand, which is, I'm sure, a class defined in Bootstrap. So the obvious question is, well, what do we really gain from this? Why can't we just hard code that into our view or into the layout? Why did the layout that was scaffolded by Microsoft, why did it go to all this effort to do all that? Well, the answer is pretty cool, but it's not all that obvious. I think that this might require a little bit of explanation, so just bear with me. In a nutshell, this HTML helper class right here that we'll see over and over again throughout the series, it actually has a wealth of helpful functionality. Here I just use IntelliSense and I'll scroll down, and you can see there are just pages and pages of methods that are available in that helper class. And we'll actually get to know many of them throughout the course of the series. But in this case, it might not be so obvious why we wouldn't just go off and do something like this. href equals / class equals whatever that was. What was it? Whatever the class was, navbar brand, and then application name. I mean, wouldn't that accomplish the exact same thing? The simple explanation is that this HTML action link method is dynamically creating a hyperlink, taking several core pieces of the MVC framework into consideration before it actually renders it out. So for example, we've not talked about routing up to this point, but we could customize routes, essentially customize the shape of URLs for our application. And the action link method would then consider all of those routes that we define prior to creating a hyperlink that would send you always to the home page for the application. Also, if we were to move our pages around, if we were to even put this layout page in a different folder, it's always going to create the correct path to the home page because we defined the action, which is the index action result method, and the controller, the home controller, as the source for the href property of our application. So it's always going to create a hyperlink that will essentially go to that method inside of that controller. In other words, we can make sweeping changes to the structure of our web application at any time, and yet, because we relied on those helper methods, we're unaffected by those changes. The helper methods are smart enough to render the correct HTML, in this case just a simple anchor tag, but it's smart enough to render the correct HTML no matter what. Of course, just like everything else, you can ignore it, but I think you'd be losing an important component of what makes the MVC framework so great. Now, having praised this HTML helper class that we looked at here, having praised it just a moment ago, it's both one of the coolest features, but it's also one of the most difficult aspects of ASP.NET MVC for new developers to embrace, because it is so easy just to revert back into straight HTML5 as opposed to including and learning all of these helper methods. But again, don't worry, by the end of this course I'm going to cover every single method inside of the HTML helper class, and I'm going to make a case why you should always, if possible, use those helper methods. It'll be crucial for us to be truly productive and to give us the most flexibility long term as we create views. Okay, so now that we've thoroughly thought through this extremely simple example, we can move on, and what I want to do is talk about enough Razor syntax that you should never need any other tutorial about it. Hopefully it'll tell you everything you ever need to know about Razor. We'll do that in the next lesson. Thank you.